The morning smelled of old varnish and wet wool, the kind of courthouse damp that sank into a man's joints and made him feel every year he had carried across sleepless sidewalks. Hollis Greer folded his hands in his lap the way Sister Noreen had taught him when he was a boy, thumbs crossed and still, as if an honest posture could quiet the tremor he'd learned to hide. The bench under him had been sanded to prison smoothness by decades of nervous defendants. It creaked when he breathed too deep. He did not look at the cuffs that joined his wrists, cheap chain, thin enough to bite, because he knew seeing them would stir old ghosts he'd promised not to invite back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The bailiff's voice scattered through the room, the ritual cough, the command, the word that turned the air brittle, all rise. Bodies unfolded like paper maps. Hollis rose slow, feeling the courthouse gravity that belonged to other men's names. On the wall, between the state flag and a tinny clock, the portrait of a former judge glared down with a mouth thin as a seam on a poorly sewn boot. The present judge, Marcus Whalen, wore the same expression as the portrait, as if he had borrowed it with the robe and intended to keep it. Hollis had walked in from the holding cell with a guard whose breath smelled faintly of spearmint and pity. He had decided he preferred the spearmint. Pity made his skin itch. The public defender, a young woman with a careful braid and a careful voice, had handed him a paper cup of water that shook in his hands, not from fear but from the untreatable disease called age. She had said, "Mr. Greer, we'll take it one step at a time," and he had nodded, not because he believed in steps but because she believed in him for reasons he hadn't earned. The case had a long name that lived in the clerk's throat, but it meant one simple thing: Hollis was charged with sleeping under the railroad viaduct on East Harrow Street and resisting the men who kicked his boots to wake him. He remembered the boots more than the men. He remembered the cold swallowed beneath that bridge as if the river itself had crawled up to sleep next to him and failed. He also remembered the paper bag he'd used for a pillow, a bag that had held 2 photographs, a brass belt buckle with wings stamped into the oval, and a grease-stiffened rag that smelled like motorcycles, like freedom when it was still affordable. Judge Whalen scanned the file the way a butcher scans a carcass, looking for the quick cuts. He tugged at his sleeve, shaped his mouth into something that tried to pass for a smile and missed. "Mr. Greer," he said, "do you prefer Hollis or Grandpa like your little friends in the gallery?" His voice carried the dry humor of a man who told jokes at funerals. A cough broke in the benches behind Hollis. Not a real cough, or reprimand. The bailiff's hand rode his holster like a horse he meant to keep obedient. Hollis didn't turn. He had learned the geometry of danger long ago: when power lives behind you, don't look back, it feeds on your eyes. "Sir," the public defender murmured, leaning just enough for Hollis to catch a whiff of drugstore shampoo and rain. "You can answer, Hollis." "Simple is good." "Hollis is fine," he said. He heard the thinness in his own voice and resented it. He'd once tuned carburetors by ear in a parking lot at midnight with a cigarette clamped between his teeth and a girl named Vera laughing into the collar of his jacket. That man did not speak thinly. That man spoke grease and highway. "Excellent," Judge Whalen said. He tapped his pen against the bench like a metronome that kept time for punishment. "Hollis, you were warned by Officer Delaney last month to stop loitering under the viaduct. You returned, and you resisted arrest when approached. Anything you'd like to say that isn't an apology?" His eyebrows rose. Laughter tittered briefly from an aisle seat and died fast. The words wanted to climb out of Hollis, words like cold and hunger and the fact that a sentence under an overpass contains more honesty than most roofs, but he swallowed them. Saying true things in a courtroom often sounded like lying. He'd learned that when he was 17 and went before a different judge for joyriding a bike that wasn't his. The world was full of bikes that felt like they could be yours if you just held on tight enough. He cleared his throat. "I got nowhere else," Hollis said carefully. The shelter was full. "My name ain't on any lease. The bridge stays whether I live right or not." He didn't say Vera's name, didn't say the names of the sons who had learned to live without him and succeeded. The judge smirked, a small convinced twist of the mouth. "So the bridge is your landlord now? Does it accept rent and empty bottles?" A few people chuckled, a few people looked at their shoes. Shame has a way of choosing its audience. Hollis felt his cheeks heat, heard the young defender's breath stutter beside him. He kept his eyes on the knot in the wood grain of the defense table. It looked like a whirl of road seen from a great height, a switchback bent toward nowhere. "Your Honor," the public defender said, steadying, "Mr. Greer has no priors for violence. He receives a small veteran stipend." "Does he?" The judge tilted his head. "Veteran of what? Panhandling?" Hollis felt the room tilt, not with dizziness but with the old sensation of a bar fight about to break. He had spent years training the need to rise out of his legs the way you train a dog away from a bad habit. He pressed his knees down and pictured Vera plucking a bobby pin from between her teeth. "Sir," Hollis said, and the word tasted like rust. "Vietnam era. Was a mechanic stateside. Kept the bikes running for boys who had to go." He didn't add that the bikes were not government issue, that some of the boys wore patches that made policemen frown and mothers cross the street. He'd learned you can carry a country at an angle and still be told to put it down. Judge Whalen leaned back as if weighing theater. "I see. And those boys, do they pay your rent now? Do they tuck you in under your comfortable bridge?" His smile was the color of a nickel. The clerk's pen paused in the margin of the form. The bailiff shifted. The public defender's hand fluttered toward Hollis's sleeve and then thought better of it. He listened to the fluorescent lights hum, a stale hive sound that made all rooms the same. Behind him, a door at the rear clicked, the kind of small noise that doesn't register until it does, like the first drop before hard rain. The prosecutor, a man with hair like a helmet and consonants that clicked when he smiled, stood and began his recital: trespass, municipal code, resist, disorderly. He spoke as if ordering coffee he had ordered 1,000 times. What nobody in the room knew yet, except perhaps the humming lights, was that outside the courthouse, the morning had started writing a different kind of docket. Hollis's stomach pulled tight the way it used to before a long ride. Not fear. Anticipation with nowhere to go. He felt for the brass buckle in his pocket out of habit and remembered he didn't have pockets, they'd taken his belt at intake. The thought made him lopsided, as if a piece of him had rolled under a workbench and couldn't be reached without getting down on hands and knees. When the prosecutor sat, Judge Whalen steepled his fingers, examined them as if prayer were something he considered when it came with a mandatory minimum. "Mr. Greer, your story is melodrama. You have made choices. Choices have consequences." He turned his head to the gallery. "We cannot be a city where bridges become bedrooms and streets become toilets. Not even for grandfathers. Grandfathers." The word bled contempt, and yet Hollis heard the syllables that used to make his chest warm. He saw, suddenly and too clearly, the face of May, the granddaughter who had been soft as bread when she was born and then hard as a polished stone by the time she was 8, because life had taught her to be. He had not earned the right to think her name inside a courtroom that measured men by their mistakes, but the heart is lawless. The back door clicked again. Another small sound. Chairs creaked as heads turned without permission. The bailiff glanced over his shoulder and then pretended he hadn't. Hollis kept his eyes forward and studied the judge's hands. They were neat, manicured, the nails squared like tiny gavels. He thought of a time when his own hands had been called steady, when men twice his size had watched him thread cable through the frame of a bike and said rude words of admiration because art always surprises even in the unlikeliest places. "Sentence will be pronounced after lunch," Judge Whalen said. "Until then." The rear door opened wide enough for Winter to walk in, although it wasn't winter yet. Boots scuffed. Leather made the sound leather makes when hundreds of miles have taught it the speech of weather. The perfume of hot oil and old gasoline drifted in like incense from a forgotten chapel. Heads turned fully now. The judge's eyes flicked to the movement and then back to his file as if to prove that nothing outside the pages mattered. Hollis did not turn. He imagined the noise instead, the shuffle of men who carried their weight low, the hush that moves ahead of people who own their silence. He knew that silence, he had worshipped in it. It was the silence of men who ride in formation and don't need to shout to be heard. The public defender breathed, "Oh, barely a syllable, like she'd seen a constellation stand up and come down the aisle. The bailiff set his jaw. The clerk capped her pen and uncapped it again. The judge cleared his throat the way a man clears brush with a machete, performative and slightly off rhythm. "Proceed," Judge Whalen said to the air, as if order were a thing you could command when the ground had shifted. Hollis looked at the knot in the table and saw it become a wheel. He saw spokes he could name by touch. He heard a laugh that belonged to a man with a face like a map of bad decisions and better loyalty. He had not said that man's name in 27 years. He did not say it now. He didn't have to. Footsteps approached. Not hurried. Not timid. The kind of approach that assumes it will be allowed. There were murmurs from the back pews where mourning spectators gave way to something larger than them. A woman whispered, "What is that smell?" and her friend answered, "Freedom," and then giggled because she hadn't meant to be poetic. The first patch flashed at the edge of Hollis's peripheral vision, white letters, red border. He kept his gaze on the knot because the knot had become a compass and the compass had become a prayer he whispered with his breath. The word he did not say slid across the room on boots and quiet like a shadow deciding where to fall. The judge lifted his eyes. They hardened with the special hostility reserved for interruptions that test a man's control in front of an audience. "This is a court of law," he said. "Not a repair shop." He looked directly at the back now, and his mouth lost the rest of the sentence. They were not roaring. No engine split the air. They had left the noise outside because noise had done its job escorting them to the door. Inside, they were theater. 60 men, some gray at the temples, some hard with middle age, a few shockingly young, filed and wearing leather vests that held history like skin holds scars. Their patches were a fractured autobiography, cities, states, memorial rockers stitched to the hem of grief, a handful of names that now only lived on the curve of shoulders and the chrome of headstones. Hollis heard the soft code, hands brushing benches to signal row by row, the small coughs, the boot heel taps, a choreography older than the judge's portrait. He had taught some of those taps to men who are now bones. He kept his eyes forward because to turn would be to invite the past to sit in his lap, and that would make him a boy in a room that demanded he stay a man. The public defender leaned so close that Hollis could feel the warmth of her throat when she whispered, "Do you know them?" He thought about lying. Then he thought about the danger of truth, and how sometimes the only safe place to put a dangerous truth is out loud where everyone can see it. "I used to," he said. The words came wrapped in a story no one in that room would ever fully hear. Judge Whalen banged his gavel like a carpenter compensating for cheap nails. "You are out of order," he declared to the collection of leather in silence. No one answered. Instead, one of the men, tall, with a beard that fell like a curtain over a complicated mouth, stepped to the aisle and faced the bench as if he had rehearsed it in a mirror. "Your Honor," the man said. His voice was clean, the kind that could read names at memorials and make people remember every letter. "We're here to observe." "To intimidate," the judge corrected. "To witness," the man said, and a ripple moved through the room that wasn't laughter and wasn't fear. It was what happens when truth steps inside a building that thought it could keep such things outside with metal detectors. The prosecutor rose, smoothed his tie as if fabric could grant courage. "Bailiff, clear the..." The bailiff didn't move. He was outnumbered by a math that wasn't about bodies but about intent. He knew it, his holster hand hung still because he understood how silence could cover a man like a shield. You don't draw a gun when the room has agreed, in some old, quiet way, to teach you a different kind of etiquette. "Mr. Greer," Judge Whalen said, trying to drag the moment back to files and fines, "we were discussing your choices." The tall biker turned his head then, not to Hollis but to the public defender, and he nodded once like a mechanic acknowledging another mechanic who had kept an engine running with sheer stubbornness and prayer. His eyes landed on Hollis's cuffs and then came back up, and for the first time since the holding cell door had slammed that morning, Hollis felt something he hadn't felt in years: covered. Not saved. Covered, like a man might be if a thunderstorm rolled in and someone put a roof over his head and said, "Stay until the worst passes." The judge tried again, and the old portrait above him seemed to frown deeper at the competition. We are not a charity. We are not a clubhouse. We are not. His voice hiccuped on the last word, and Hollis realized the judge had not decided how this sentence ended. Power rarely practices for interruptions. Power assumes. The biker with the beard stepped forward a single pace. He did not swagger. He did not threaten. He did not look like the movies. He looked like an old friend of Gravity. "We're here for Hollis Greer," he said. "Grandpa Hollis. For the record." He lifted a folded paper, creased and stained and precious, and held it up with fingers that bore scars and shapes mechanics recognize the way sailors recognize knots. The clerk blinked. "For the record, what record?" "Ours," the biker said, and the words scooped up the gallery like a front wheel lifting over a pothole. "We keep one, too." Hollis's knees trembled. He exhaled a laugh that wasn't a laugh, more a release valve sigh. He knew that paper without reading it. It would be a photograph printed off a phone at a pharmacy, the one of him at the end of a long table in the back of a dim bar, a cake in front of him iced with the words "You still owe US stories." He had stayed sober that night on nothing but laughter and coffee that tasted like penance. That had been years ago, before the bridges and after the last apartment slipped through his fingers like a wrench left on a fender and forgotten until the highway reminded you with a clatter at 70 miles an hour. Judge Whalen recovered enough to perform disdain. "This is a court of law. Your presence will not alter the administration of justice." The tall biker nodded. "Good," he said. "Then it won't bother you if we sit quietly and listen while you humiliate our friend for not having a house." The word friend bent in the air as if picking something up. Hollis swallowed. He didn't cry, not here, not for this, but he felt the sting behind his eyes that says a dam has remembered it used to be a river. The judge's jaw flexed. He had a choice between doubling down and stepping back. Men like him rarely choose the third option, learning. He straightened. "Mr. Greer will be remanded until sentencing." "Bailiff." The bailiff glanced down the aisle where leather had taken root. He chose the oldest option, time. "Yes, Your Honor," he said without moving. Outside, engines rumbled, a vibration more felt than heard, like a line from a song you can't place but somehow know all the words to. The courthouse windows filmed with a subtle fog from the breath of bodies suddenly made conscious of their lungs. Hollis finally turned. Slowly, because you don't swing your head like a boy at a parade when you're a man being measured for the rest of his life. He turned and let the room lay itself out, faces he didn't recognize next to faces he did, older now, softened or hardened by marriages and funerals, patches that read cities he had slept in, names spelled in thread over hearts that had once beat so hard on a Tulane at dawn that he had sworn the world would hear. At the rear, framed by the open door, a figure stood half in shadow. He wasn't tall. He wasn't theatrical. He wore his years the way some men wear a good jacket, broken in, owned rather than borrowed. He lifted two fingers in a gesture that was nothing to anyone who didn't know, and everything to those who did. The inside of Hollis's chest answered with a convulsion that was 90% memory and 10% prayer. The judge's voice seemed to come from far away. "Mr. Greer, face forward." Hollis turned back, but his ears stayed with the door the way a dog's ears go where they please. The tall biker folded his paper and slipped it into his vest. "We'll sit," he said, and 60 men sat in a single motion like a long muscle flexing under the skin of the room. Lunch recess, Judge Whalen snapped, feeling more in command of sandwiches and clocks than of whatever had just walked in. 1 hour. He hammered the gavel as if he could nail the hour to the wall. The bailiff called, "All rise," because rituals are how you keep the roof on a house in a windstorm. People stood, locked eyes with leather, glanced away. The judge vanished through his door trailed by the prosecutor, both of them speaking with their shoulders. Hollis remained standing because standing felt like the only thing he could do right. The public defender touched his sleeve, a contact so small it felt like someone tapping ash into his palm and saying, "Hold this, will you?" The tall biker approached. He stopped a respectful distance from the rail that separated Hollis from the rest of the world. "Grandpa," he said softly. The word was not an insult in his mouth. Hollis worked his tongue against the dryness that had made a home there. Didn't think there'd be this many left. More than you think, the man said. His eyes were kind, but not soft. They pass on, more stand up. He glanced at the cuffs. You hungry? Hollis smiled with one corner of his mouth the way a man smiles when he is trying not to show his teeth lest the smile turn into a break. Always. Thought so, the biker said. He looked at the bailiff, who looked at the cuffs, who looked at the ceiling as if it might offer legal advice. The biker said, "We'll wait." He stepped back, gave Hollis a nod that felt like a key turning inside a lock. The public defender whispered, "Who is he?" "A ledger," Hollis said, surprising himself. "He keeps the names." The hour thinned. Sandwiches arrived for the court staff. The prosecutor did not come back, the judge did not come back. The bailiff checked his watch. The hum of the lights seemed louder, as if buzzing could be a barricade. On the dot of return, the side door opened. The judge re-entered with a face you could shave on. He took his seat and studied the leather row as if it were a math problem stubbornly refusing to become an answer. "We will continue," he announced, and the wooden room admitted the sound without gratitude. "Sentencing," the public defender prompted gently, prepared to build a bridge out of language over the gap between what is merciful and what is permitted. The judge ignored her. "Before sentencing, this court wishes to ask a question." He looked past Hollis like a teacher looks past a student to the window. "Why," he said to the air that smelled like oil and old gas and rain, "do 60 men ride into my courtroom for a trespass case?" Silence can be eloquence when enough boots agree. The tall biker took one step forward, and the others didn't move because they didn't need to. He said, "Because the man you're about to sentence once kept our engines alive, and then he kept us alive when we were mean enough to die without help. Because we pay our debts." He paused. "Because he's family." The judge's expression shifted, almost invisible, like a man negotiating a lower price with his conscience. Family takes care of their own before a bridge becomes a bed. And sometimes a bridge is all a man has until family finds him, the biker answered. Outside, thunder rolled. No, not thunder. Engines. 100 more, at least. The windows quivered, and dust fell from the frame of the old portrait like snow finally admitting it was ash. The judge's eyes widened and then narrowed, and the bailiff's hand went to his radio without knowing what to say into it. Hollis felt the vibration crawl up through the soles of his shoes and into his bones, into the hollow places age had carved, into the spaces hunger had made and pride had furnished sparsely. He stood there in a suit borrowed from the public defender's office, cuffs on, knees tired, and for the first time in a decade the air filled his chest without permission as if air remembered him. "Enough," Judge Whalen said, and his voice cracked on the F as if it had found its limit. He lifted his gavel. "Mr. Greer." The rear door opened again, just a hand's width, and the small man in the shadow stepped inside, his face finally visible in the cheap fluorescent piece. Hollis's heart lived and died in the same second. The man's hair was white now, but his eyes were the color of risk on a clear day. He smiled in that way that had gotten everyone in trouble and out of trouble often enough to make loyalty a religion. The judge saw the smile and mistook it for insolence. "You," he said, pointing with the gavel, "out. Now." The small man lifted a hand. "Not to defy. To speak." He said the softest sentence in the room's hard history, "Your Honor, I'm here to pay what's owed." The gavel hung in air like a broken promise, and the courtroom stopped pretending it knew how this story ended. And then the doors behind the small man swung wide, and the brass buckle Hollis didn't have any more flashed on a belt he had once tightened on a boy who'd cried and said he didn't deserve it, and the boy had become a man who had stayed and stayed until staying had earned a new name. The clerk made the sign of the cross with her eyes. The bailiff forgot his radio. The public defender gripped Hollis's sleeve like a ship grips an anchor in weather. "Mr. Greer," the judge tried again, and the echo refused him. The engines outside rose like a congregation that remembers the hymn without the book. Hollis exhaled the last of his aloneness. What the small man said on the rail between them was not money and was not papers and was not mercy. It was heavier. It made the judge's mouth open and close like a fish suddenly remembering water is in air. It made the leather in the room lean forward as if leaning could be law. It made the past sit down in the present and suggest they talk. It was. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. It was. Not paper and not money, though there was paper beneath it and money folded within. It was Hollis's old brass buckle, the oval with the wings that had once ridden his belt through rain and lean years, set gently on top of a thick, creased packet like a seal. The buckle caught the courtroom lights and returned them as something softer, as if hardness had remembered the hands that had polished it before long rides. Beside the buckle lay a dog-eared DD-214, the only diploma Hollis had ever kept, and under that, a cashier's check the size of an apology. Hollis stared at the buckle until the rest of the room blurred. He felt the ghost weight of a belt at his hips and, beneath that, the older, truer weight of a life before bridges. The small man who'd brought it, face weathered to truth, kept his palm resting on the packet like a mechanic keeping a steady hand on a warmed manifold to feel the beat. "Your Honor," the small man said. His voice didn't carry like the tall biker's, it settled. "Name's Calder Pike. Folks call me Pike. We're here to pay what's owed and to put what's broken back together if you'll let us. This is Mr. Greer's discharge." He tapped the DD-214 with 2 fingers, his vet ID, an intake approval from the county veteran housing coordinator, signatures there, and a cashier's check to cover every fine and fee stacked on his name. "If you'll release him to our supervision, he'll have a bed by sundown. Not a bridge. A bed." The judge made a sound like a chair scuffing tile. He looked at the buckle and pretended not to, then looked at the check and pretended that's all he was looking at. "This is highly irregular," he said to the room, and to himself, and to the portrait above him that had seemed stranger. Hollis felt the public defender's breath catch beside him. Her hand hovered over the packet as if it were sacred. "Your Honor, under 12B of the Municipal Code, you can consider structured release to a verified address, especially with full payment of fines and a service plan." She sounded like she'd found a hidden shelf in a library and pulled down the exact book everyone said didn't exist. The prosecutor stood, smoothing his tie the way a man smooths out. "Your Honor, we can't let clubs dictate courtroom outcomes." Calder Pike turned his head toward the prosecutor, not unkindly, like a weathered tree turning its rings toward the sun. "We're not dictating. We're paying. And we're promising." He looked back to the judge. "You want a plan? Here's ours. He stays at the veteran house 3 blocks from St. Noreen's, curfew at 9. Every morning, he reports to Greer and Sons," Pike's mouth tipped with a private smile. "Not as Greer, ours is short for Green River Engine and Electrical Repair. He'll sweep floors, log parts, and run the ultrasonic cleaner till his ears hum. We'll put him on the bench when he's ready. 2 AA meetings a week, we'll take him. Chaplain will see him Tuesdays. He'll check in with the county caseworker Friday mornings at 9. We'll put it in writing thick enough to stop a bullet." The judge's eyebrows climbed and then retreated as if embarrassed to be caught climbing. "And when he fails to comply? When he wanders back to his bridge?" Hollis didn't mean to speak, the words rose like a tide returning to claim old shore. "I won't," he said, and heard how thin that sounded next to leather and engines and checks with numbers that startle. He swallowed. "I can follow a clock." He looked at Pike. "If you'll have me." Pike's eyes warmed, and in them Hollis saw the winter he'd survived in other men's kitchens, the coffee poured into hands that shook, the grease under nails that never entirely left, a family crest you couldn't wash off even if you wanted to. "We already do," Pike said. The judge leaned forward. Up close, Hollis could see the pores on his nose, the way power looked just like any other skin when magnified. "Mr. Greer," the judge said, quieter now. "Why didn't you come to the court with this before? Why let it become theater?" Hollis thought of the bridge and how it did not have doors. Thought of how doors could be harder to open than courtrooms when you were dressed in yesterday. He let the truth through before fear could translate it. "Because I was ashamed," he said. The word emptied a room inside his chest that had been crowded for years. Because I forgot I was still a man folks might show up for. He looked at the buckle. Because I thought the stories I owed were past due. 60 patches breathed in unison. You could feel it, the way a room can become a lung if everyone agrees to breathe together. The prosecutor tried again, his voice sharper now that something gentler had entered the proceedings. Your Honor, the people can't endorse supervised release to a motorcycle club with a history of, he searched for the right noun, incidents. Call them memories, Pike said without moving his eyes off the bench. He slid a second sheet from the packet. Letter from the County Veteran Housing Director, Your Honor. Says in plain words we're approved partners. We move furniture, install handrails, ferry men to appointments when the bus forgets them. He lifted his chin toward the back. We carry coffins when family is only a word. Something shifted then, not in the judge's face but behind it, a chair scraping on old floorboards in his head. Hollis saw it the way a man at sea can read far water by the way the nearer water rises. The judge tapped the edge of the DD-214 with the back of his pen. Mechanic, he read softly. United States Army. Honorable. Hollis nodded once. He could have said, I kept engines alive so men could feel the wind before they went where the wind couldn't help them. He could have said, I learned to listen to metal like it was a language. He said nothing. The silence held. Bailiff, the judge said, voice attempting stern but landing unequal, remove Mr. Greer's cuffs. The bailiff hesitated. Procedure is a well-trained dog, it doesn't like new tricks, but then the keys appeared and the click was louder than it should have been. The chain came off Hollis's wrists and left behind the pale band's shame leaves when it has been sitting there a while. He rubbed the marks as a free man rubs his eyes upon waking. The leather road didn't cheer. Respect has no need for confetti. A few men tipped their chins. The public defender exhaled a breath that had been wrapped around her ribs for an entire morning and maybe a few years before that. Judge Whalen set the pen down. Here's what I'm prepared to do. He looked directly at Hollis. Suspended sentence. 6 months unsupervised custody converted to community service, 200 hours at Green River Engine and Electrical, verified by weekly logs. Mandatory participation in the County Veteran Support Program with housing compliance. Curfew at 9 for 90 days. Random checks. Miss one and the suspension lifts. Full fines paid in advance by, he flicked his gaze to Pike, by whomever is so determined to carry your ledger. Pike nodded once. We'll cover and we'll collect the only way that matters. He looked at Hollis. Stories at the end of shift. Every day. Hollis felt his mouth open around a laugh he didn't let out. Yes, sir, he said to Pike before catching himself. Your Honor, he added to the bench. Everyone heard the order and understood which mattered more. The gavel came down gentle as a father's hand on a fevered brow. So ordered. The engines outside softened, as if the building itself had told them a bedtime story and they'd agreed to listen. The bailiff stepped back from Hollis, and the public defender finally let her fingers rest on the packet, on the buckle, like a believer touching a relic. Mr. Greer, Judge Whalen said, and the edge had left his voice. Don't make me regret this. Hollis looked at him and saw not a mountain but a man holding a sign in a storm that said, this way. He nodded. I won't. He meant it with the full weight of his elbows and knees and everything in between. The court clerk called the next case, voice a shade steadier than it had been at 9 a.m. The 60 men rose like a field of wheat finding the wind, and the gallery parted because people know when they've seen something that shouldn't be trampled. Pike stepped to the rail. You coming? Hollis didn't trust his legs until he saw the door. Then they remembered how men walk when they are expected somewhere. The public defender squeezed his arm once, quick, fierce, grateful, and said, bring the buckle back for the next old man. I'll bring the man, Hollis answered, and surprised himself with how sure it sounded. They filed out into weather that had finally chosen a direction. The sky above the courthouse was the color of a faded denim jacket. 60 bikes waited on the curb like loyal dogs, chrome catching the gray and throwing it back as silver. People had gathered behind the barricades the city set up on its best days and its worst. Phones lifted. A few hands did, too, and Hollis felt the heat of them as if they were stove coils. He paused on the top step and looked down at his hands, free, empty, shaking only the way old hands shake when you ask them to carry something they've been waiting to carry. Pike pressed the buckle into his palm. It was warmer than it should have been, as if it had a memory of a chest and a belt and a life. "Put it on," Pike said. "I don't have a belt," Hollis said. "You do now." Pike held out leather that had been cut for him decades ago and had somehow not shrunk the way time shrinks things. Hollis threaded the buckle and cinched it. The weight settled patient and right. He inhaled and the belt didn't bite. It held. The tall biker with the beard wheeled a bike forward, not for Hollis to ride. Nobody who's slept under a bridge last night should straddle 1,000 pounds today, but to lean on while the world adjusted. "We'll walk," he said, and the 60 nodded. A walking thunder. They moved as one toward a cluster of vans idling at the curb, County Veteran Services stenciled on the doors. A woman in a navy windbreaker with a lanyard full of keys smiled at Hollis in a way that made his bones want to sit down and be told it would be all right. "Mr. Greer?" she asked. "I'm Alma. We've got a set of sheets with your name on them." Hollis nodded because people were offering him nouns, bed, sheets, keys, and he was still learning how to hold them. Can I stop somewhere first?" He looked at Pike's face to see if the question broke any rules. "Greer and Sons," Pike said. 10 minutes. This van can shadow us. We'll keep it slow." He tipped his chin to Alma, who read the silent code correctly and nodded. "We'll meet you at the house, Mr. Greer." "Don't keep me waiting, curfew starts today," she said with a smile that didn't need teeth to be bright. They crossed the street like a parish, engines idling behind them like an organ left in a low chord. A few civilians clapped without knowing why they were clapping, and a boy on his father's shoulders shouted, "Grandpa," because the word had found a new definition. The shop sat 3 blocks away, a cinder block rectangle with a sign hand-painted in a script that had more affection than accuracy. The air inside was the ambrosia of solvent and hot metal and a coffee pot that had decided to live on the edge forever. Benches. Vices. A pegboard of wrenches like a xylophone you play with your wrists. Hollis stood in the doorway and had to catch the jam like a man touching a ship he thought had left years ago. "This bench," Pike said, patting the scarred wood, "is yours if you want it. Today you sit. Tomorrow you sweep. Next week you listen. The week after that you talk. We'll leave the harder miracles for later." On the bench lay a carburetor broken down into its talking pieces. Next to it, a notebook with a row of names. Pike handed him a pen that had spent years writing in shirt pockets. "Sign," he said softly. "You clocked in the day you kept us alive. This just makes it official." Hollis wrote HOL, and had to stop because his hand decided to be a river again. Pike didn't look away. No one did. When Hollis finished his name, the letters looked like they'd learned to stand upright again after a winter spent bent. Hours squeezed and widened. Coffee appeared and disappeared. A boy with a shaved head and a grief patch on his vest brought a stool and didn't say who the patch was for because Hollis did not ask. Some losses you honor by letting them sit there humming. By late afternoon, the carburetor clicked back together in a way that felt like a polite conversation coming to a good end. Hollis held it up and the shop made a sound men make when the world still answers to hands. "House," Pike said, as if summoning it by naming it. "Before Alma sends the militia." They rolled out with a small procession, 3 bikes, the van, Hollis in the passenger seat because he'd earned the right to look out the window and be taken somewhere worth going. The veteran house was a turn-of-the-century brick that had once been a boarding home and had stayed one stubbornly. A porch ran the length of its face like a grin with a few teeth missing but still charming. The door opened before they knocked. Alma stood there with a clipboard and 2 mugs of something that steamed like forgiveness. "3rd floor," she said. "Clean linens. Locker in the hall. Curfew at 9. House rules on the wall, nothing you haven't survived harsher." She glanced at Pike. "You going to let him sleep, or you got him sweeping at dawn. Dawn, Pike said gravely, and then grinned. Kidding. 10. Alma laughed the laugh of a woman who had carried too many clipboards and not enough casseroles. You boys keep him busy and I'll keep him fed. She turned to Hollis. There's a telephone upstairs if you want to call anyone. She made it a gentle noun. Hollis nodded. He felt suddenly 17, and also 70, and also the exact age of a man who's been given a bed. Thank you, he said, and the words sounded insufficient because gratefulness is a warehouse and the mouth is a glove compartment. He climbed the stairs with his hands sliding along the rail. The hallway smelled like lemon cleaner and men's cologne from a decade ago. His room had a window that admitted actual sky. The bed looked like it would forgive him. On the pillow lay a folded shirt, the shop's shirt, Grer & Sons stitched in crooked red because someone had run out of ease and decided one or could be persuaded to do double duty. Pike set the buckle on the small dresser. You sleep with that in your pocket, he said. Not because you'll forget who you are, but because sometimes at 2 a.m. you need to feel the past and the future at the same time. Hollis sat. The mattress traded a sigh with his bones. He looked at the telephone on the wall, at the numbers that had been waiting years not to be dialed. He stood up again before he could talk himself out of it, lifted the receiver, and pressed familiar digits that moved like a prayer he'd once said nightly and then forgotten until tonight. It rang twice. Then a voice older than the last one he remembered picked up. May. Not a question. The mouth knows the shape of its children's names. Hollis couldn't speak at first. Then he did. Baby, he said, and the glass of the window blurred, and in the street below the bikes revved once, soft as a lullaby, as if engines could hold a man upright while he finished the hardest sentences of his life. I heard, May said after he'd stumbled through what mattered and what didn't. I seen a video. People posted. She laughed once, short and unbelieving. They called you Grandpa Hollis like you belong to the whole town. Maybe I do, he said, surprising himself again. But you get the first share. Silence stretched warm. Then, you got a bed? I do. You got a job? I do. You got people? He looked out the window at a row of leatherbacks waiting for him to finish his call and begin his life. I do. Then come see me Sunday, May said, voice steady as law. Bring whoever fed you. He set the receiver back in its cradle and sat again before his legs made their own plans. Pike stood in the doorway and pretended to study the house rules to give privacy that wasn't privacy at all. Good, he asked without turning. Better than, Hollis said. Night came on with the kind of speed the city saves for days when it has had to hold its breath. The curfew bell in Hollis's chest chimed 9 long and merciful times. He lay in the bed and listened to the building negotiate with its pipes and the floorboards discuss old knees with the men who hauled themselves to bathrooms and back. The buckle rested on his chest, heavy enough to persuade the heart to keep its rhythm. Sleep took him with the hands of a friend who has finally figured out how to lead on the dance floor. He dreamed of roads that had decided to run toward him for once. He woke at 6 without an alarm because his bones had voted yes during the night. Coffee downstairs, the kind that tastes like it has seen some things. Alma offered eggs like a sacrament. Outside, air that hurt in a good way. The shop day opened like a well-oiled hinge. Hollis swept with a devotion that would have made a sermon unnecessary. By noon he was bending over a Suzuki with a carb set that wanted to talk back. By 3 he had told a story that made 2 young men wipe their eyes when they thought the others weren't looking. By 5, Pike clapped his shoulder and didn't say what his hand said, proud, glad, see, because men like Pike prefer verbs to adjectives. At 8:52, they walked him back to the house because a man learns rules by obeying them before he tests them. The porch light washed the steps in kindness. Alma leaned against the door with a ledger and a grin. 2 minutes to spare. Always had a good clock, Hollis said. Keep it, she said. This place eats broken ones. He went upstairs and stood at the window, the town below him the size that makes a man believe it can be held. The courthouse dome glowed like a slow-lit ember. Somewhere inside, the judge sat at a desk too big for his regrets and opened a thin envelope he had found tucked under his door after recess, a photograph of a boy in a borrowed leather jacket, a belt with wings 2 notches too big, and a note that said, "You don't get to decide what a man is worth when you haven't seen the ledger." Hollis didn't know about the envelope. He only knew he wanted to keep his boots by the door so he could put them on fast in the morning. He lay down, the buckle on the nightstand, the past within reach but not in charge. Days became a string you could follow in the dark. Work. Meetings. Coffee that forgave. Stories at shift's end that pulled old names into the kind of light that doesn't interrogate. Sundays with May that hurt in the beautiful way healed things do. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the court day that had been too big for its own walls, a kid not old enough to shave walked into the shop with a helmet tucked under his arm and a face trying to be brave. He had a patch waiting to be earned or rejected. He looked at Hollis like a question. Hollis wiped his hands and saw all the men he'd been and all the men who'd held the line for him until he could stand up straight and hold it back. "You here for work?" he said, making it a statement. "Yes, sir," the kid said. "Then sweep," Hollis said, handing him a broom like a knighthood. "We'll teach you engines when you learn how to make a floor worth standing on." Outside, the sky broke open in a summer storm that wrote its own drum solo on the shop roof. Pike walked past, tapped the buckle where it lay under Hollis's shirt as if it were a heartbeat he could tune. "Still fits?" "Like it was waiting," Hollis said. "Good," Pike said. "Tonight after close, we ride to the river overlook." He must have seen the flicker in Hollis's eyes because he added, "Van for you. You're not straddling anything without a seatbelt till you decide with your doctor and your bones and your sponsor." "But you're going with us, here?" Hollis heard. He felt the river in his elbows. Sunset painted the ridge with the kind of orange old men wear well. They parked in a line on the overlook and let the engines tick cool like contented animals. The town lay below, the courthouse caught in the last flattering light of the day. Pike lifted a thermos. "To debts paid," he said. "To stories told," the tall biker added. Hollis lifted nothing but his face to the wind. He thought of the judge who had learned a new word for mercy, of the bridge that had lost a tenant, of a granddaughter who had invited a table to be bigger than blood, of an oval of brass that had remembered its job. He put his hand on the rail of the overlook and felt the hum of distant engines through the metal, as if steel remembered steel. He didn't know if the rest of his life would stay this clean. He suspected it would not. Lives, like bikes, run rich or lean depending on whether you can't always see coming. But he knew the shape of a bed and the angle of a bench and the sound a door makes when it opens because someone is glad to find you on the other side. He knew where to put his hands when something stopped working. He knew who would stand up in a room and say his name without flinching. Back at the house, Alma checked the ledger at the desk and made a small star by his name because she liked how stars looked next to men who didn't ask for them. Hollis climbed the stairs and set the buckle on the nightstand and folded his shop shirt over the chair back the way you fold maps you plan to use tomorrow. He turned off the light and the room did not argue. Quiet can be a choir if you've lived loud enough. He lay down and let the weight of the day pin him gently to the mattress. He slept the sleep of a man who has become easy to find. In the morning, the judge stepped out of a diner with coffee and saw 2 bikes parked nose to nose by the curb. The riders nodded. He nodded back, a man learning a language late in life and grateful it has room for beginners. He would not say he had been wrong. He would say he had been reminded. Sometimes that's harder and better. Hollis never went back to the bridge except once, with Pike, with a broom, with a bag. They left the spot clean. You don't spit in a well you once drank from. You don't live in it, either. On a Sunday a year later, May's boy, Hollis's great-grandson, held the buckle in both hands like a planet and asked how it worked. Hollis showed him. You thread the strap through the frame. You hook the notch. You pull the leather tight enough to hold but loose enough to breathe. The boy nodded solemnly as if this were a sacrament, which it was. That's how you keep pants up, the boy announced. That's how you keep a man up, Hollis corrected gently. News doesn't remember every man who finds his way back to a bed. That's fine. Patches do. Benches do. Bridges do. The judge does, in the careful way he chooses his words now when a man without an address stands trembling at a lectern. When the town speaks of the day engines idled outside the courthouse like a weather report and leather filled a room built for other fabrics, they don't talk about intimidation. They talk about a ledger being balanced in public, about a buckle catching light, about a man standing straighter while his friends sat behind him so he could see over their loyalty to the horizon. They talk about what happens when a community refuses to let Shane finish a story. Hollis keeps sweeping after hours. He says it helps him think. He tells a new story every day because he owes them and also because he likes to get paid in laughter that doesn't mock and quiet that does. Some nights, late, he stands in the doorway of the shop and listens to the river carry the town's secrets like a patient mule. He touches the buckle through his shirt without thinking and says thank you to nobody in particular. The word arrives where it needs to. A man doesn't get a curtain call in real life. He gets mornings. He gets people. He gets work. He gets a bed and a belt and a bench, and the permission to live long enough to become the kind of old that makes room for the young without bitterness. Hollis plans to take it. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.